Welcome to the Drake Group's webinar series on critical issues in collegiate athletics. Today's discussion, Name, Image, and Likeness 1.5 years out. What have we learned and potential pathways forward? Our moderator is attorney Julie Summer, president-elect of the Drake Group.
The focus of today's webinar is Name, Image, and Likeness, colloquially referred to as NIL. As we are 1.5 years out approximately, and we're wondering what have we learned and what are the potential pathways forward. And we're honored to have a stellar group of panelists today. You may have had a chance to read our panelists' full bios when you registered for this program, but I will briefly introduce them, and they may add additional information as to their role in their work in their firms with NILs and college athletics before I ask them to respond to the first question. Also, I want to emphasize that the panelists are expressing their own opinions, not the opinions of the organizations in which they are employed or of which they are members, unless they make that distinction in their remarks. All right, let's begin with some brief introductions of our great panelists today. First, we have Matt Brown, publisher of Extra Points, a D1 ticker publication covering business, policy, and educational issues in college athletics. Next, we have Cassandra Ramsey, attorney and the sport law chair for the District of Columbia's Bar Arts, Media, Entertainment, and Sports Law community. Next is Len Simon, of counsel at Robbins, Geller, Rudman, and Dowd, and an adjunct professor of law at Duke University, the University of San Diego, University of California, Irvine, and the University of Southern California Schools. And last but not least, we have Andrew Whittree, NIL and sports business reporter for On3, a Sportico sports business writer with over 3,200 Twitter followers and a journalist who covers NIL deals and NIL collectives. And I'll just add that he and Matt have seemingly worked nonstop to keep many of us updated on NIL and the ever-changing world of college athletics. So we'll begin here with really an open-ended question. And given that we're closing out on the first 2 years of college athletes being able to control and profit off their NIL after 100 years of restrictions by the NCAA on outside earnings. So the question is, what have we learned? And please feel free to add your role in your work in your firms with NILs. I'll begin with you, Matt.
Sure. Ladies and gentlemen, thanks so much here for having me. It's a pleasure to be able to spend some time here with all of you. This is a good question, and it's one that I get asked a lot from our readers, some of whom work in the industry, some of whom are students or just general fans. The principle I keep coming back to is there are really two different NILs. And I think we really have to be careful about making that distinction when we try to make sweeping judgments or analysis of where this industry and where everything is going. I believe we have one segment of NIL where deal activity is driven by market forces, with companies wanting to work with an athlete or a camp or some other kind of commercial activity, where the brand is doing so because they want to gain some kind of commercial advantage or opportunity. We might talk about this later, but I've done NIL deals with over a dozen athletes to promote Extra Points. And I wasn't doing that because I'm secretly a homer for Notre Dame track and field or Ohio State fencing or BYU cross country. I did that because I was trying to buy access to those students' audiences. And that world does very much exist. I would argue it's been particularly beneficial to many women athletes. It's not exactly the same industry we might have expected a year and a half ago, but it exists. And we can talk about that world specifically, I think, today. But there's also another world where, in my view, it's pretty transparent that NIL money is being funneled through either donor collectives or charities or third parties. It's very transparently a talent acquisition payment. You're not giving money to an athlete because they're especially marketable or because they're going to participate in a camp or they're a great guitar player. You're giving them this money because you want them to play for a certain university or remain at a certain university. Things that typically were against NCAA rules, even though I think most of us understand that these sort of under-the-table payments have been happening one way or another since Yale was a national football power, or Princeton. It's not a new thing. The markets, both of these two NIL worlds react differently to market forces. They're made up of different people. They have different goals. They have different metrics. And I think we might err a little bit if we lump them in too much together when talking about NIL.
Thank you, Matt. Cassandra, what do you feel we've learned?
Yes, hello. Yes, I'm Cassandra Ramsey. I'm the founder of the law office of Cassandra Ramsey PLLC. And as stated, I am also the sports chair for the DC bar, where I'm assistant putting on programs like this, and I've even done some programs on NIL throughout this first year. And this question, comes up a lot, like what have we learned? Where are we going? I think that we have seen that it has, for the most part, been very beneficial to the athletes, and particularly to women's athletes. A lot of people posited that it wouldn't benefit athletes at smaller schools or in our revenue generating sports, and we've seen the opposite, that we have had a lot of opportunities come from athletes from non-revenue producing sports. I'm sorry. I think that I'm sorry. I think I think that as we continue to go through this, we will continue to see NIL continue to grow, but we also have to remember that we are only almost 1.5 years into it, so there is still a lot of things that are being working out, a lot of data that we still need to really kind of see where these things are going to go. One thing that has been the most interesting to me has been the NIL collectives and that coming up, and I think Matt just kind of spoke about it, like boosters funneling money to the schools and issues around that. The Drake group issuing the letter to the Office of Civil Rights to see what the Title IX issues are coming to, and I think we'll get into that later in this discussion. But yeah,
Thanks, Cassandra. Len, what would you say that what we've learned and where we're going? You're on mute, Len.
Okay, I think Matt has either stolen my thunder or set me up very well, because I think, first of all, as part of my introduction, the only thing I would add is that I worked with Nancy Skinner to pass California Senate Bill 206. So I was there at almost the creation, not quite, but almost the creation, and throughout all the amendments and the fights and late night phone calls with state representatives who were unhappy about the bill. It passed almost unanimously ultimately, but there were a lot of unhappy campers. I think what we had in mind and what Senator Skinner had in mind was what Matt described as market force NIL. And I think market force NIL is extremely helpful for the athletes, for the sport, for everything else. It's what people had in mind, that college athletes should be able to monetize their name, image, and likeness, just as would an art student or a music student or someone else on campus. I think the talent acquisition raises a lot of difficult issues about improper recruiting, about false promises made to athletes, and deals that don't really work out, deals that have hooks on them, like you can't transfer, or you can't take a semester off, or whatever. And really the question presented to the NCAA and to the college sports world is, do we hate the market? Do we hate the talent acquisition side of it? And if we hate it, can we do anything about it? Clearly, the NCAA froze when they read the Alston opinion, particularly the concurring opinion by Justice Kavanaugh. And just at the time when they were sort of in the batter's box and had to either take on the talent acquisition NILs and say, no, we're going to stop you, or they had to let it go, they feel like they were forced to let it go. They were frozen. They were afraid of an antitrust case. So that's the open question. The first piece is healthy as heck, and the second piece is controversial as heck. And if you can't regulate it, it doesn't really matter what you think about it. But I think it could have been regulated if they started at the beginning. Now it's going to be harder. The toothpaste is out of the tube.
We've heard that metaphor before, haven't we? The horse is out of the barn, or the toothpaste. Okay, Andy, what would you say in response to Len and that question?
First off, thanks for having me. And I would say, we've learned the earth is still spinning, right? It's still on its axis. All the doom and gloom arguments about this is going to be the end of college sports, so there's only, a fraction of all athletes that have earning potential or marketability. It's only for football or men's basketball players. We've learned a lot of those weren't true, right? And obviously, as Matt mentioned, there are kind of two components of NIL. As we have our valuations at On3, which include a roster value and a brand value. It's as if Patrick Mahomes had his Chiefs salary and his Aflac or Geico salary all kind of combined, as I say, you can kind of, you can Trojan horse it almost with NIL. but take out that. I mean, you can find ways that everyone can benefit. We've seen, D2 and D3 athletes that are very marketable, very personable, walk-ons that might play offensive line who've built a great TikTok audience and found national brand deals. We've seen the ratings in not just football skyrocket in the last season, but we've seen, women's gymnastics and women's basketball and softball and sports that finally have exposure by the major traditional media companies that have really thrived and found their audiences. And those athletes have had chances to pursue NIL deals too. So I think a lot of the doom and gloom, while there are some arguments for those within college athletics about employment status and maybe travel concerns with conference expansion, I'm not sure that the granting of NIL rights itself is that issue.
Thank you. Matt, you have your ear to the ground in a lot of interactions with athletic directors, conference commissioners, other administrators. We have a quote here from an outgoing Cornell athletic director, Andy Knoll, who stated last month nationwide that the NIL situation has been an absolute disaster, the worst change he's seen in college athletics in his entire life. Do you agree with that statement at all? And if not, or if you do, why do you think an administrator, a former AD or a former now AD, would feel that way?
I definitely don't agree with it. And I honestly think I'm probably more of a critic of a lot of how the NIL world has transpired over the last year than many of my national media colleagues. And even then I would say I would think that kind of statement's a little ridiculous. I understand why an administrator might feel that way. It has unquestionably captured a lot of their attention. It's sucked out a lot of oxygen in the room. And a fear that I hear from a lot of coaches that would go up to an AD is how much NIL makes the recruiting process even more transactional. If it's not about building relationships, if you're not about selling your degree programs or competitiveness or these other things that have been part and parcel of the recruiting process, it just becomes, what's the collective going to get me and what kind of bag can I secure on campus? That changes the relationship completely and could create a different environment for roster management. I understand that world exists. It would be difficult to convince me that world meaningfully exists at Cornell. The kind of athletes across all of their sports, with maybe the exception of some hockey and wrestlers, is mostly not in that world. And you're hearing this more from other ADs or from people calling you up and asking about it rather than what's happening. I think the major counter argument that I would posit to an AD that feels this way is to look at your athletes that are currently taking advantage of this world at all. And at a place like a Cornell or an academically selective mid-major institution, like maybe a Patriot League school or something else, based on my conversations, I would say a decent estimate is somewhere between 6 and 12% of all of your athletes are doing anything with NIL right now, where anything could mean anything from a $50,000 product, deal to a free t-shirt and free water bottle or something. But even if you're only getting a couple of bucks, or even if you're only getting some free product, what these opportunities allow athletes to do is engage with the business community, to engage in quasi-internship opportunities that they may not be able to realize because of their academic constraints, and an ability to increase their social network. Being in, and Julie, and you know this very well, and I'm sure many of the people on this call know this very well, the life of a college athlete can be pretty lonely. And your world on campus can shrink to be pretty small just inside that athletic building. And with NIL, now you have a chance to actually meet people who are involved in financial services or sales or white collar work that you might not have ever otherwise known. And when I think about this, even as somebody that's pretty critical of some of the bag world or what's happening with agents and everything, I look at this and think, isn't this part of what we're supposed to be doing in higher education anyway? This is a pathway to help people not just wealth, but build a path for themselves professionally. We should be excited about it. I think any AD that looks at the totality of all this, sees what I just described and go, it still sucks. I feel like I don't think you're well equipped to function in this world now, because it's what athletes need is different.
Right. And I would agree with that. It allows college athletes to connect with their community in a different way, in a more meaningful way, in terms of connecting with younger athletes and helping them out, perhaps coaching, doing clinics. Cassandra, what would you say in terms of the outgoing Cornell AD statement?
I totally disagree. It's definitely not, in my opinion, the worst thing that we've seen come to college athletics. I mean, come on, we have athletes who, a lot of what Matt was saying, athletes who would not get that recognition because they don't play, for the D1 number two in the country football team, but now they have an opportunity where they can use their social media or build a community through NIL, and they are able to get more opportunities. I was just speaking with an athlete who was able to use their interest in film and everything to garner NIL deals to help film and take pictures of other athletes who play their particular sport. That's a wonderful opportunity that they would not be able to have before NIL, because such a deal would have been looked at as an impermissible benefit, and then they would have been in jeopardy of losing their collegiate eligibility. I think some of the undertones too of that statement is a lot of people look at NIL like it's professionalizing college sports. Whether or not if it is or isn't, it's not the first thing that could have been used as an argument that we are professionalizing college sports. Everybody else is making money, billion-dollar broadcasting deals, million-dollar coaches' salaries. So how can you really look at the opportunity for athletes to make some money, which most aren't making millions of dollars, right? They're only making a few $100s or a few $1,000s. And that's able to help them supplement, especially for those who don't have full scholarships, or for those who, their scholarship is not able to cover all of their costs, food and being able to have their car if they have one on campus. So I think that that's a very kind of narrow view of it. And if you really look at NIL as a whole, it's a great thing. I even saw an article that talked about the number of athletes who were staying in school and not entering the draft, because now they're weighing, should I enter the draft and try to professional ranks, or should I stay in school and, try to take advantage of these NIL opportunities?
Thanks, Cassandra. I'm glad you brought that up in terms of expenditures in relation to what athletes are now able to do with NIL. Len, I'll pose to you, but I'll add just a few other statistics, and taking in the Cornell AD's statement in context, that total revenue for college athletic programs have risen from $4 billion in 2003 to over $15.7 billion in 2020. The NCAA already bounced back from the pandemic to grow from $519 million in 2020 to a record $1.16 billion revenue in fiscal year 2021. We have football coaching salaries and the amount of contract buyout monies for not coaching, essentially, spending $530 million just to fire college football coaches over the past decade, statistic per the Knight Commission. New conference, billion-dollar media rights revenue deals, higher expectations of play, length of season, playoff games, longer travel times with conference realignment. So taking that into context, how would you answer that question? You're on mute again.
I think it's been answered pretty well by my colleagues, but I would say, yeah, a lot of money is sloshing around college sports. I mean, when we were doing SB 206, Zion Williamson was playing at Duke, and I can't count the number of times people said Zion's producing a ton of money for Duke, a ton of money for the ACC, a ton of money for the NCAA, and he gets zero. And that was just an inappropriate situation to be in. The details, as I said, the details could have been handled a whole lot better. There could have been some fair guardrails. There could have been some reasonable elements. And I would say to the Cornell athletic director, you're way off base. But if you don't like parts of this, if you want to know who to blame, blame Indianapolis, blame the NCAA. They slept through the opportunity to rationalize some of this activity. The president of Purdue University said almost the same thing right at the beginning. It's terrible. We need to get back to when college sports were played by college students. And my reaction was, they haven't been played by normal college students for a long time. But if you don't like it, then manage the job. You can't be afraid of your shadow. NCAA's got to do what it thinks is right. If it gets sued, it defends itself reasonably rather than the way they've defended themselves over the years, which has been to fight what you can't win and let other things go. So I think it's had a bumpy start, but it's a great idea. And we've gotten away from the picky NIL violations of the past, in which athletes, often small-time athletes, have gotten in trouble over nothing. So we've cleared that out. We've created the market force NIL for a lot of athletes, white and black, male and female, big sport and small sport. And we've created a few bad headaches about Miami or $13 million contracts or whatever. So people don't like it, work on it. Don't complain about the whole project. Work on the rough edges.
Thank you. Yeah, I think that contract was actually, we can round it up, it was 13.8 million. We'll talk a little bit about that later. Andy, you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, just to piggyback off Matt, like, am I missing some like $20 million collective at Dartmouth or Columbia that we just don't know about? Because I don't think that Cornell's AD has been exposed to that. If you heard like an SEC AD who their team finished like 5th in their division, maybe that's more reasonable, but I would still disagree with that AD too. So for Cornell of all schools, I found that interesting. And to Lynn's point, go back to the Alston opinion, right? Scroll 20 pages into that 70 or 80 page document. They mentioned the very first, or what's believed to be the very first, intercollegiate athletics event, and it was a sailing competition at some lake. It was sponsored by a railroad company in like 1871 or something. The participants were offered free booze. It was a marketing ploy. So to some degree, when that's the founding spot of college athletics, like, we can be honest and know that's where we came from. Sure, is that the norm? Is that every event? No, but this has kind of been, to that degree, there's always been some level of commercialization of marketing efforts. So take your booze-ridden train ride up to lake wherever. That's kind of where we've been. And I would also say there's a few surveys recently that Bill Carter has done. He's of Student Athlete Insights. He interviews or surveys rather. It's like 1,000 current D1 athletes. A recent one basically said that I think it was 8% of athletes said that NIL has been a locker room problem, which is a very small percentage. And then in a different one, I think it was 37% said that their coaches use NIL as a reason for explaining away either bad individual or team performance. And so that shows a bit of a disconnect, right? When the athletes believe that, hey, what 1 in 11, 1 in 12 think this is a problem, where 4 out of 10 coaches do, that shows that sure, their job is understandably more difficult when it comes to recruiting, roster retention, roster building. But I don't know if it's the issue that the same way that some coaches and administrators believe it might be.
Right. I'd like to move a little on to the transfer portal, which has been a big issue at least for the past year, and the new transfer waiver guidelines from the recent NCAA convention and transformation committee. We know that the original NCAA NIL guidance, they had an entire set of rules, as well as a separate entity to administer and track NIL agreements. Those were scrapped. And in the wake of the Alston decision, they hastily adopted those 4 guidelines, which were basically: 1, individuals can engage in NIL activities consistent with the law of that state. If there's no state law, they must follow the school or the NCAA rules. 2, college athletes attend the school without a state law. They can, of course, use their NIL rates, is 1. 3rd, individuals can use professional services provider, i.e. an agent or other. And 4th, that student athletes should report their NIL activities consistent with the state law or school and conference requirements to their school. So keep in mind, all the other NCAA bylaw rules and rules are still in effect for inducements to attend or remain at a school, or things that may be seen as an impermissible benefit to an athlete, such as direct pay or benefits outside what's allowable by current NCAA rules. And we know that college athletes have been taking advantage of the portal and transferring more than once. And the council voted to update those guidelines to allow a one-time transfer and then a second time with the strict criteria for a waiver. We're not really sure how that's going to work out in terms of those waivers. My question is, do you believe NIL rights have complicated or greatly affected the transfer portal? And I'll start with you, Len.
I think it's the opposite. I think NIL has greatly complicated. I guess they both greatly complicated each other. It was bad luck to have NIL and open transfers happen at the same time, because something we're struggling with is the recruitment of high school athletes properly or improperly, with or without NIL inducements. And instead of working through that intelligently and watching what's happening and creating guidelines for it, we had high school seniors and college freshmen, sophomores, juniors, 5th year, whatevers, all being recruited and all being offered NIL deals and all having to face this question of whether there's an improper inducement in the NIL deal. So I think if NIL had come in 2000 and the transfer rules had come in 2020, it would have been a much smoother entry into transfer rules and a much smoother entry into NIL. So I do think the two have just created a little bit of chaos. That's probably what's affecting the guy at Cornell and the president of Purdue, all saying, "Oh my God, the sky is falling." There are a lot of moving parts, but it will work itself out. It's exactly the same issue. It's all improper inducement. I mean, it's all healthy except for improper inducement, which some people think is unhealthy. And I think we need to get our arms around what's an improper inducement and how well can we regulate it. We didn't regulate it that well in the past. We had people going to jail talking about what strong offers, Will Wade made to some guy to get him to come to LSU. So it isn't like it was a clean system before, but it's unclean in a different way now and on a broader scale when you've got 5 graduating classes of athletes available to be induced at the same time. So I say that's the only downside is I think inducement issues grew rapidly and the NCAA got overrun.
Matt, do you agree with that or not? Or do you even see a way for the NCAA to more effectively enforce this rule?
Well, I think a lot of the effective rule enforcement at this point would probably be more of the domain of Len or Cassandra, because my understanding is these are legal questions. You can set some kind of policy that would limit athlete compensation based on banning inducements and everything, but you can make whatever policy you want. If that doesn't line up with the Sherman Act, and it doesn't matter, you're going to be in court, and I think we've seen how that's typically gone. I would, for me to describe what is happening, this is not me making a value judgment about whether a college athlete should consider money when deciding where to go. I'm not going to clutch pearls over that. But I mean, it is, I think, patently obvious that athletes right now, particularly in men's basketball, baseball, and football, are hitting the transfer portal as a mechanism to either negotiate with their NIL collective group at their current campus to try and increase their base compensation, or to find a higher paying opportunity somewhere else. And they are particularly in men's basketball, that activity is being pushed by agents, which tend to be a different pool of agents than those who represent athletes in the NFL and the NBA. We could talk about that later. My concern with how the transfer portal and NIL fit into that, it's not so much that athletes would be getting money for labor. I don't know about any of you, and I consider where to go as an undergraduate. My scholarship package and grants and short-term compensation were certainly among the things I considered, and that's been true for every job offer I've ever accepted. My concern is more about who's giving that advice and to what extent can any of the parties involved verify that the information that they're getting is accurate. It's much easier for me to figure out how to sell, how much a used car is going to cost than it is what I could potentially get in the portal and whether I should sacrifice my eligibility, move elsewhere. Those are related issues, but I think much more difficult ones than just is the portal having an impact on this. I think that's pretty transparently obvious.
Cassandra, do you have thoughts on that from your perspective? You're on mute.
Yes, I have 2 thoughts. One is, I think that we should try to remember some of what led us to having a transfer portal and allowing athletes to more freely transfer, which was exactly that, allowing them to freely transfer, because you have cases where coaches leave and that coach is the one that recruited the player, and the player may want to go and try elsewhere, or a player may have a personal reason that they need to transfer to a school that's closer to home. So it's easy to kind of let the NIL overshadow it, as both things kind of happen at the same time, and to think about the effects that NIL may be having over the transfer portal. But it's important not to lose sight of why the transfer portal was even created, which kind of leads to what Matt was talking about as far as the NCAA and their now attempt to limit the second opportunity to transfer to certain cases that has to be justified with the waiver. And I think Matt is absolutely right. They could again be subject to some type of litigation on an antitrust front or some other kind of litigation case, which is why I think we've seen the NCAA being kind of slow to move in the NIL space, period. They recently came out with some new guidelines and this new presumption that they're going to put on the schools to show that an NIL violation hasn't occurred. And that, it's a topic that we may get into a little bit further, but even that of itself could open them up to some other type of litigation, because it's like now you're placing the burden on the school to show that no violation has occurred. And kind of how does that work it's kind of like a guilty until proven innocent thing when we're supposed to be innocent until proven guilty. So that's all I have.
That's right. You're going right into my next question, but I want Andy to add any thoughts he has on the transfer portal and NIL.
Yeah, it is kind of a funny chicken or egg question, right? Because kind of as both, right? They were both, I forget, forgive me the exact timeline, but it was in the same academic year, school year, right? Where the transfer portal, which, it's kind of a misnomer, right? Because the portal existed before the one-time transfer exception. It's now the players can play right away. And it wasn't even all sports that was new, right? There were other sports where it wasn't football or men's or women's basketball, but you could transfer and play immediately, which gets back to some of these revenue questions that, Cassandra has mentioned and that you listed, Julie, right? As far as how much money exists in this ecosystem. And then, I think to Matt's point too, is that it is kind of silly. It's weird if we're kind of being, and I say we, the royal we, right? To be moralistic or consider the ethics of like, okay, what role should NIL play in transfer decisions or where I go to school? Because any student, forget athletes for a moment, any student that should play a role, right? I got into Northwestern. It's an amazing journalism school, but guess what? That's going to cost, at the time, I think was like 70 something grand per year, which is a great school, but that's a lot of money, right? And so I went to Indiana, also a great journalism school, had a few scholarships. That played a role in where I went, as it should have, and no one should begrudge me for that. And so it's funny now that, kind of the order of operations, right? Where a school or a coach or administrator can say, hey, our current quarterback makes X, the current running back makes Y. And then if an athlete chooses to go there, they can maybe expect to earn that. That's safe, that's fair game. But then if it's switched where it's, hey, we will give you this to come here, the concern lies in what Matt referenced, where it's who's making that promise. Are they a registered agent? Are they a sophomore in college? Are they 22? Is that money in the bank somewhere? That's the real issue to me is who is making that and how verifiable is that? Not the should money factor into this equation, I think.
Julie, could I ask Matt a question? Matt, I'm curious about your comment about transfers, because I'm a Duke basketball fan and a Duke alumnus, and I think the people who are transferring in and out of Duke basketball certainly, and football probably as well, are not doing it for the money. I think they're doing it for playing time, or ACC versus mid-major or something. Now maybe that's the exception rather than the rule. And the people leaving were leaving because they were riding the bench. They were a seventh man for Coach K, and they wanted to go someplace and play and score. So I just wonder if money is driving as many of the transfer moves as you might have suggested, among say the Power 5 schools.
I think what I would say to this is, as a general public, I think we err if we try to boil transfer decisions or roster management or where athletes decide to go to a single variable. People are not single data points. They have myriad things that they're interested in, and that's how recruiting works. I can't speak to the NIL situation at every single institution, and there are going to be athletes that are not as motivated by short-term money, either because they come from money or because they're just focusing on that second professional contract, and they're more motivated by location or coach relationship or scheme or many other things. And you have some, and this is not a value judgment, it's just a reality, who are going to be motivated by money. And then there are going to be some that have to value lots of different variables. I think I can't speak to Duke specifically. I am aware of people that I trust that across the Power 5 and men's basketball specifically is money a primary, not exclusive, but a primary factor in leading to roster changes. Yes, I do believe that, and I believe that was honestly the case in recruiting in men's basketball before at NIL. The money was just coming from other places. I don't think we've seen an example right now of a team successfully build a really good roster just based on more transactional transfers. And this is probably more Andy's wheelhouse than mine. We just saw Marquette, I think, has a top 10 program right now. They didn't take anybody, and they did that on purpose, to maybe grab one or two people to provide the leadership or fill a particular hole in the roster. That is a thing. In my professional opinion, I think this is more of an issue in the transfer market with men's basketball, and it's more of an issue when recruiting high schoolers for college football.
And did you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, and I think this is one of those kind of albatross contracts and, headline grabbing scenarios that we saw last year with kind of the first true, if we want to call this college free agency, with the Kansas State transfer Nigel Pack that went to Miami. Basically coincidentally, or not coincidentally, at the same simultaneously, as he transferred to Miami, the billionaire booster John Ruiz announced, "I'm signing Nigel Pack to a 2-year, $800,000 total contract with a car." Nigel didn't know that was public. He said as much last month. John Ruiz has used that number and the engagements off that tweet to validate the cost that he paid. So it's a little bit circular there. So when that, and the story that Matt referenced on CBS Sports, that kind of set the market when that becomes public, when the athlete didn't know it's become public. That is this high profile occurrence, right? And we saw a returning player from that team who was part of their Elite Eight team, who, a win shot of the Final Four, basically tried to kind of renegotiate his contract publicly. And this is basically showing this is kind of free agency. So like Matt mentioned, I think it is maybe a men's basketball thing. We get a little preview into it last spring. We'll surely see the same to some degree this spring. But it's because of that one deal, I think, that kind of set the market publicly on Twitter in a way that the player didn't realize was going to happen.
Cassandra, you've already brought this up in terms of, there's a few names for it now: the NIL presumption, strict liability, guilty till proven innocent. So take your pick on what you want to call it, but I know you're all aware of the revised recent NIL guidance and charging standard that went into effect January 1, aka the NIL presumption. This is bylaw 19.7.3, meaning the NCAA's enforcement staff will presume a violation occurred when it receives information on the activity deemed actionable, such as a tip or a news story. And then the burden of proof will then fall on the implicated school to get to the bottom of the situation and prove that no violation occurred. I have a couple questions on that. How is this enforcement approach different from past enforcement procedures of the NCAA? And two, if you'd just like to answer legally, do you believe this can stand, or is this a layup for a lawsuit?
I think it may be in the future definitely a setup for a lawsuit. It is like a strict liability standard. I just don't think that it's really fair to kind of put that burden on the schools to be able to, to just say, okay, this NIL violation didn't happen, especially when the NCAA has given such little guidance in NIL, which we know is because they fear lawsuits because of what has happened with Austin and other lawsuits that are still coming down the pipe with the House versus NCAA case, which is all based on antitrust principles. So they're trying to stay away from that. But it very much felt like the NCAA's standard here was just like a last ditch effort to try to retain some control in the name, image, and likeness space. And maybe there are situations where schools may be okay with it because it can kind of help to rein in some of the things that are happening with NILs, particularly in the case with collectives where we don't really know what's going on. I think one case, either it was coincidence or it was a direct result of the case with Jaden Rashada, where he was slated to go to Florida on the University of Florida, had a $13 million deal. However, that money breaks down with the Gator Collective, and then all of a sudden the deal falls through and he requests out of his national letter of intent. So one of the examples that the NCAA gave in their issuance of the standard of review was that anybody who represents the school's interests, such as a collective, cannot announce or enter into verbally or in writing a deal with a prospective college athlete before they enroll, which I think based on that, you can kind of see that it probably was a direct reaction to that to prevent those type of situations from happening again. But I think that, with the right case coming along, the NCAA could be opening the door for future litigation.
And what are your thoughts on that? Is this legally stand or another layup for a lawsuit?
I'll take a little different tack on it. Disclaimer is I've never done an enforcement case. I'm an observer from the outside. I do have a law degree. I've done antitrust cases and a lot of other things, labor stuff. But look, the NCAA has no subpoena power. They've been complaining about it for as long as I can remember, decades, which means if there's a big story in the Miami Herald, college player, induced to come to University of Miami with $100 million deal, dancing girls, free liquor and marijuana. They can't prove it. They can't do anything about it. And I think what the NCAA is saying in maybe a less articulate way than they should have, that if there is soft evidence of a violation, they're going to force the school to come in and provide them enough information so they can make a decision based on the preponderance of the evidence. I don't think it's strict liability, Cassandra. I don't even think they're shifting the burden of proof. I think they're almost shifting what lawyers, maybe the burden of proof, but not the burden of persuasion. They're shifting what's sort of called the burden of coming forward. They're forcing the school to come in and say, or the boosters come in and say, that didn't happen, here's what we did. And then if the NCAA takes all the information available to them, weighs it, and decides that a violation has occurred, I'm not sure you're going to beat them in court on that. I think I'm a dissenter on this one because there's a lot of talk about how unreasonable it is. But it's a reaction to the lack of subpoena power and to what's been going on in the NIL market. Maybe it's an overreaction. It sounds worse than it is.
I'm glad you made that great point. Go ahead,
I just
Cassandra.
want to say I definitely can agree with that take on it as well. And I also wanted to make the distinction that I have not worked in NCAA enforcement either. I'm just speaking from my experience as an attorney.
We value your legal opinions here. I'm glad you mentioned that no subpoena power with the NCAA. That's important. Matt, do you interpret this to mean the presumption, not an NCAA investigation, but the schools must then prove the violation didn't occur? How is this different from previous procedures?
Yeah, this is a good question. And between all of us friends, like I have had a chance to actually recently speak to people in Indianapolis who work on these investigations, and we've some of my colleagues and colleagues at other media outlets have been able to talk to higher level NCAA enforcement folks. And everything that I have heard and everything that I have read recently would indicate that Indianapolis is not super interested in going after the athlete in these kinds of investigations. The people that they really want to kind of turn the screws to are the boosters, which present real problems for the member schools from a governance perspective, not just from a inducements perspective. If you have a car salesman who's built himself a little NIL collective that has an $8 million budget that the car salesman is using to induce athletes, that is the new general manager of your program. In fact, that in some ways you might argue that's your new athletic director, who's no longer accountable, and that power dynamic scares schools deeply. And I think, I'm sure this is old hat to everyone listening to this, but when we complain about something that the NCAA is doing, it is generally not a single rogue bureaucrat in a cubicle somewhere in Indiana. It's because member institutions are asking for this. And there's deep frustration among coaches, ADs, and above about, we don't know where the rules are. We are surely walking as upright citizens, but our peers are breaking every single rule in the book, and we need to be able to have an enforcement mechanism to bring these other scoundrels to justice. When then the wheels of justice turn on them, maybe then they start screaming about the Sherman Act. So we'll see. The one thing I would be confident in, if we think back maybe the last decade, we remember athletes that would get dinged a couple of games because they signed some autographs and they sold them, or some of their merchandise appeared somewhere. These real ticky-tack amateurism things. We generally really haven't seen people lose eligibility for that over the past couple of years. And I would imagine that continues. Whether the NCAA is able to actually use any of their powers to meaningfully punish a school or a coach or a collective operator, that's a question for Len and Cassandra and our friends who are operating in the world of billable hours. That goes beyond my meager education. I can only report on what I'm seeing and hearing.
I'll add to that before I get to you, Andy, on that. Matt, do you think administrators' frustrations stem from the lack of the defined rules of the NCAA or lack of the enforcement?
I think it's both, right? And you can't really have defined enforcement if there's not really defined rules. And I think to Andy's point a little bit earlier, we have guidance. We've had clarifying guidance from the NCAA, but the state rules on even just reporting for NIL are pretty different. And what is something that may be obligated for an athlete in Missouri might be expressly forbidden in Alabama, and not mentioned by statute at all in Utah. And then trying to police that nationally. This is why you hire Charlie Baker. This is why you beg for Congress. This is why you try to do all these other things, because then enforcing some of those smaller rules becomes a major challenge. To what extent those complaints are born out of a reality that can actually be changed right now, I don't know. But I do know that there is a substantial frustration with the status quo.
Andy, what are your thoughts about this new onus on the institution?
Yeah, first off, I know Matt and I have joked about this, but it's funny, when you cover this beat of, sports business and NIL and all that's going on, as a reporter who I'm not going to pretend to have the background that Lynn and Cassandra have, but we kind of have to almost cosplay as a cardiologist or immigration attorney or, all these different jobs that we don't have the background for. So I'm not going to pretend to have the background that Cassandra and Lynn do. I will hopefully add, which is hopefully maybe, insightful or adds something to this discussion, is that when they talk about, news stories or social media posts, a lot of the boosters and people that run collectives like to hear themselves talk or see themselves talk or have others see themselves talk. So I do think there could be a component of their own Twitter feeds and their own quotes that they've given on the record. Could that be somehow used to what kind of Len mentioned as, he worded it well, but I forget, the kind of the persuasion of, hey, we have this now. Can you come to the table and let's discuss this, and we'll try to keep your athletes safe, retain their eligibility. But Mr. John or Jane Doe donor has tweeted this publicly, and they maybe, I've seen clauses from NIL contracts that people will just tweet, right? There's no reason they had to share. We have this kind of clause in our contract, right? Or back to Miami. Here are the terms. This number of years, this dollar amount. There's a car. No one had to do that, right? So I do wonder if there's a certain degree of, sure, it's not the message board poster that they're just going to take that and run with it. They've said publicly, John Duncan and the folks at Indy, that, hey, we think we're pretty reasonable people, not here to overreact, not here to cause a witch hunt. But I do think we should watch out for, hey, if you can't trust the guy or gal that runs your collective, and they've had a whiskey and Coke or two, and they're on Twitter, they might be saying some stuff that they probably shouldn't. And I think that could maybe be used against them someday. So just one thing to put out there too.
Right, they're so closely related, right? Were you going to say something, Matt?
I was just going to say, Andy is not exaggerating for comedic effect here from everything that he's just said. I would encourage our friends listening to maybe take everything he just said very literally, because that is what happens.
Let's talk a little more about the rise of collectives, and just for edification here, collectives are formed and seemingly independent of a university, where they pool funds from boosters and businesses to help facilitate NIL deals for athletes and create their own ways for athletes to monetize their brands. As Christy Dosh just noted, collectives too are growing their rosters. It seems there may be more deals making the news from collectives than the marketplaces these days. And in over 1.5 or so years of NIL, there are hundreds of collectives which have popped up, mostly at Division I institutions. So my first question on collectives are, do collectives combine with the NCAA not so much enforcing their outside employment rules or inducements or pay-for-play rules? Do they undermine the ability of institutions to comply with NCAA rules? Sorry, I'll start with you, Cassandra.
I think on some level they may, especially for those that are operating, independently from the institutions, because they're kind of coming up, kind of like Andy was mentioning, they're coming up with these ideas and marketing themselves as, hey, we can help the athletes get this kind of deal or get that kind of deal. Or some have even going on to say that their goal is to help keep athletes at a certain school and not transfer to another school. And that's very problematic because that's kind of like an inducement. You're trying to retain the player, which is what the NCAA explicitly said cannot happen. But you have collectives who are working on behalf of certain students at a university. So for, somebody who may not, be fully paying attention to what's going on, they really may think that that collective is associated with that university, and so that the university is working to retain players in that way. So that definitely makes it problematic from the NCAA side and the school side with trying to stay compliant with the NCAA's policies and legislation.
Thank you. Len, any thought on that in terms of the
Well, I
collectives?
mean, it multiplies the number of people who can commit violations, and it takes these people have no bosses. If you take a university, there's an athletic director. Everybody who could violate NCAA rules before there were collectives reports directly or indirectly to the athletic director. Everybody has access to a lawyer in the athletic department who can tell them you can or cannot do something. And everybody could get fired for improperly inducing an athlete and getting caught. Even not getting caught might get fired. These people are just car dealers, businessmen, entrepreneurs. They report to nobody. And they got big egos. They want to be seen as a big booster of Oklahoma, a big booster of Miami, a big booster of USC. So yeah, it multiplies the problem exponentially, I think, to have boosters running around making deals with athletes.
And Matt, let me add to that. What if an institution says this may have occurred, but it wasn't us, it was our collective?
And in some cases, that might actually be pretty persuasive. I can think of a handful of places, and perhaps Texas A&M with their news most recently, it would be one where you'd say, yeah, the school and the collective are separated like a political candidate and his PAC. Like you're really working in hand in glove, and anybody with a Twitter account kind of knows. And in some cases, the athletic leadership and the people that run the collective might be downright adversarial, and so that they really aren't working together. I think, and by all means, anyone, please interrupt me here. Like, I think it would be helpful for us to realize that collective can mean a lot of different things. Essentially, like by definition, it's just a group of people that are funneling money together and working with athletes. We have a handful of NIL collectives right now that are essentially operating as for-profit marketing agencies, a baby version of Wasserman or Rock Nation or CAA, if you will. And you have some that are working as complete nonprofits. You have some that are trying to work as nonprofits and are almost certainly violating tax law. And you have some that are essentially a couple of message board dads, where there's no real level of sophistication or fundraising apparatus. It's just people passing around the hat on rivals. And I think this is important because, the collective that Bradley or Bryant or I think Northern Iowa just set one of these things up. The ability for that group to change athletic department policy, to change recruiting decisions, to get into trouble the same way that the Gator Collective might, it's not really the same thing. So I think I would encourage people that are writing about this or trying to get in the weeds here to peel back and try to think about what kind of collective are we talking about? What are their goals? What are the competencies of the individuals who are running that organization? What are they trying to do? Because they're raising money in different ways, they're supporting different athletes, and they might have a very different relationship with their athletic department.
Andy, any thoughts on that?
Yeah, let's get nerdy for a moment. So once again, I have a journalism degree, so let's talk about words because I think words should matter, right? So like Matt mentioned, collective, until it is in Merriam-Webster with an agreed upon definition of this is exactly what it means, it could mean so much. So last week, Alabama announced an entity. They were very clear that we have an entity at Alabama. Seton Hall announced a collaborative, not a collective, a collaborative, I think like the next day. Texas A&M, which Matt mentioned, I wrote a big story on 3 this morning that I'm very proud of. The first question asked last night of their 12th man foundation, which is independence. Word does a lot of work there, but independent, we'll get to that in a moment. The guy that runs the foundation was asked, are you the first collective set up in this manner, where it's the independence, kind of official, unofficial booster fundraising group. And the guy corrected the reporter and said, well, we're not a collective because we're a 501c3. But there are collectives out there that have the word collective in their name that have filed for federal 501c3, public charity status. So it can mean so many different things. At this point, I call it like a catch-all. I call it an umbrella term. I think it applies to basically all of them, right? You guys can argue amongst yourselves as far as what does or doesn't apply. I know Oregon's, they call it like a vehicle, I think, like a different word that no one else uses. So, there's no one definition that's important. And then to Matt's point of, these are all independent, right? But, I'm aware of, you might have a school SID that kind of brokers a call between a media person and a collective. I've seen SIDs where they might comment on whether their school is going to have a collective or not. We've seen schools that have announced they have a collective. So independence is a funny word. Once again, getting back to Texas A&M, which is the first school that, as far as I know, that directly they're independent. Once again, independence. Booster Club is now taking NIL donations because, unlike a lot of other schools, it's its own separate 501c3. And then they made clear online, I think they said that we are independent in like fact and function, I think was the phrase roughly. But kind of like what Matt mentioned with, political candidates and their PAC of like, sure, they're two different filings. If you go to, the government or the local, Secretary of State website, it's going to be two different things maybe, but like, we all know what's going on here. Like we have a pulse and a brain. So I think that maybe it's important to say maybe they are independently funded, right? Unless there's ever some big scandal where a school is secretly funneling money directly from the department to a collective, the funding is independent. But as far as, strategy and communication, I think it's fair to say a lot of them aren't independent, and that's not accusing anyone of wrongdoing, right? Like they'll say we have communication, we have calls, state laws are modified to allow this. So I think we can say that many of them aren't independent. And that's not saying that they violated NCAA rules or state law or alleging they've done anything wrong or immoral. But I think that the funding isn't independent. But like Matt said, because of what collective can and can't mean, the range is so big, it can mean different things in different places. I'll just say that.
Certainly some schools are coming out and saying this is our primary collective. And sort of that whole guise of the idea of a collective sort of lording, be careful what you have out here, lording themselves over athletic directors and departments. University of Alabama, which Matt just mentioned, recently unveiled and proposed on-campus NIL center for their athletes. Just to mention in our first annual Drake DC Symposium last year, Tom McMillan, head of Lead One, mentioned at the time that he believed that Booster Collective should be brought in-house. So I guess I'll pose that back to you, Matt. Should we bring collectives in-house with institutions?
It's a good question. And that's not the first person in the last 2 weeks that I've heard make that suggestion. And I can understand why, but part of that, just setting aside the ethics of paying athletes or anything here, just looking at this from a pure nuts and bolts administrative function, turns out that fundraising is a specific skill. And we have schools hire lots of expensive development professionals because sustainably fundraising is hard to do. One of the, I think, errors that a lot of the early big NIL companies made at the, a year ago, the ones that were running marketplace exchanges, was I think that they didn't appreciate how labor intensive and messy and complicated it can be to broker deals, especially because a lot of the companies that would benefit from working with athletes don't know anything about influencer marketing. And it takes labor to build those things. I was literally talking to an NIL collective at a Power 5 school today that was like, please don't print this, but all of our donors are over 70 and we haven't figured out how to engage the business community or anybody under 55 at all. And can you help us? And I'm like, no, I'm a reporter. I will not. But that kind of speaks to this world. Booster clubs are good at those things. Your athletic department has development specialists who allegedly are good at those things. They have people that understand compliance. I would imagine it would probably be better for either booster clubs to take on some of this responsibility, or to answer a question here that was posited in the chat, an MMR company. Like I could see a world in a year or two where a Learfield or a Van Wagner or a JMI takes a much more aggressive role in the market making part of collectives, because there's no third party that has more expertise in that assembling those kind of deals than a Learfield. And they can do it probably more efficiently and cheaper than maybe somebody who's very good at selling pressurized lumber in Alabama, to use a hypothetical example.
Thank you. Cassandra, you have any thoughts on that?
I think from the point of the last question, I think that maybe going in-house would help from a from a compliance perspective, would help and make sure that the collectives are compliant with the NCAA's NIL policy and legislation for sure. So it can help root out some just impermissible things as far as contacts with high school recruits or anything from that nature. And I also think that it may I also think that it could also lead to some further disparity within college athletics too, though, because not every school has an NIL collective or has the funding to have some type of NIL collective or a big booster with the school. So again, you'll just see more disparity with schools that are able to have a collective like in-house versus the smaller schools and everything that isn't. So.
Great. We'll talk more about some of those inequities and how they may or may not be translating over to that. There's some evidence there is. Len, what do you feel about the in-house collective issue?
Well, if you bring them in-house, I mean, then you really have to face what's going on. It's no longer independent. It's now school, it's essentially school-controlled money. And it gets back to the inducement question. I think you have to answer the question of whether the NCAA is going to enforce any inducement rules, any recruitment rules, before you decide where a collective should be and who should control it and how it should operate. If there are inducement rules, bringing the collective in-house is kind of a disaster. And it's a Title IX disaster as well, because you're making it, it's all school activity. Every single thing that's done is done by the university, and it triggers Title IX obligations to treat women the same way. And it more seriously puts you in the line of fire of the NCAA for an improper inducement. So I think the whole, we're going in a big circle. The whole purpose of the collectives that began was to do it seemingly independently and make it seemingly less guilty. But I think they found that it was hard to do that. Who you're going to give money to a high school quarterback? Maybe you need to talk to the football coach as to which one he wants before you start opening your checkbook. There's 100 reasons why you want to cooperate with the school, but you sort of run headlong into the issue of, are there NIL rules? I keep coming back to the same question. All these questions would have been simpler if the NCAA had bit the bullet, and once it was clear that NIL was here to stay, had issued some guidelines and attempted to enforce them, whether they were stronger or weaker. And I don't think they've ever done it or come to terms with it. So I don't know. It's more honest to bring the collectives in-house. I would agree with that. Now we're playing a little game, but the game was driven by the rules at the time.
Thank you. In the interest of time, I'm going to start folding in our Title IX question into that in a moment. But Andy, do you have anything to add on the in-house collective issue?
Yeah, just quickly, not to linger on A&M. I know they've kind of been the king of the offseason for NIL talk 2 years in a row now, but I think we'll almost kind of see that now with their latest, they claim not collective, their fund as they call it. And once again, it's an independent organization, but it's probably as close to in-house as we'll see under the current landscape, the current model. And there's only a handful of schools that even can do that based on their structure. Florida State, Clemson, Arkansas actually has a similar setup to A&M. It's kind of one spot removed. LSU. Not every school can do this, but this might be kind of the tribal right of how does this work? You can commit money to any athletic program at the school. It's not just football, it's not just men's basketball, which is kind of a must for Title IX concerns, right? And then the donors that do contribute to this fund, they can get their priority points, so their parking passes and where they sit, when they can buy seats, stuff that no other collective can offer because they don't have that same perk system. So this might be our trial balloon for better or for worse is at A&M. And I do wonder to some degree, as far as true in-house, where is the school, is the athletic department, will that take outside influences, right, from courts or from the government? Once again, not to like get out of my depth, I'm not an attorney, but I wonder if outside factors might have to happen first for collectives to truly be brought in-house, not this kind of like elbow length distance apart, like A&M. So I wonder if, this is the preview, and then in 3 to 5 years, maybe we do see, based on court rulings or the NLRB or what have you, would that be the impetus to then kind of bring them in-house? And this might be kind of our first look at how that might work.
Thank you. And we've seen in terms of NIL data and what we've been able to see, we've heard a lot of great anecdotal stories. We've heard a lot of great anecdotal stories about women athletes doing really well in NIL. We know that's happening. But we still don't have the really hard data, right? We don't have a third-party administrator. That idea was scrapped by the NCAA leading up to Alston. And this is why we rely on the hard work of the Andy Wittries and the Matt Browns who are on the ground following these things, and others, and companies like On3, like Open Doors, like Altius and Scry, they've been very helpful in collecting and being open-ended and sharing their data. We learned last summer of the proposed NIL Education and Information Center, the nonprofit at Arizona State with Oliver Luck. So I think, I guess my first question would be, do you see great value in collecting that NIL data? Not so much, I don't want to get too far in the weeds about whether it should all be publicly disclosable, but in terms of that, I think we'll be able to know more about compliance and where we are with issues like gender equity. Would you agree with that, Matt?
I think it would be immensely useful to have a lot of this data. And I say that not as a self-interested, nosy reporter, although unquestionably, I would also benefit from being able to look at some of that data. I think, honestly, the biggest beneficiary here is not the compliance departments or the risk management folks or the athletic directors. The group that I think would benefit the most would be the athletes themselves. Because right now there is not real clarity in the market, particularly for NIL value independent of marketability. Andy, I say this with deep love in my heart. You know how I feel about you. The On3 valuation right now, which has become like the one that a lot of the national non-college sports media uses to talk about NIL, it may become very accurate later on. It's not super accurate right now. And the people that benefit the most from the lack of that information in this market are agents or predatory rent seekers or third parties that try to get between the athlete and a school, a potential opportunity there. If you were able to know, okay, well, based on all of this data, I know that an athlete a baseball player in the SEC can expect somewhere between $25,000 and $75,000, and I can have an idea for what to be asking for, like we can for negotiating a salary or buying anything in the store. You can feel confident you're not going to get as ripped off as much, and that's not what exists here. The problem is actually pulling it off, and I'm pretty skeptical that it does. We don't have this data really for the pros, right? Nobody is tweeting Adam Schefter to exactly what someone's endorsement deal does. We have that data for their salaries, which is very useful, but that's also because of it's a collective bargaining agreement, and all the parties involved have decided to make that public. We don't have that in college. And I've talked to a couple of folks that run NIL collectives, or even people that work at NIL collective companies, if you want to get really meta about it, who, when I've asked them about Oliver Luck's idea, have responded so passionately that they would not share that data that I could not directly quote them in a professional setting. The Oliver's ability to get that data for the biggest players here is not going to happen without a warrant. There's a real incentive for the attorneys and for the agents involved here to not really share that information. So what we get are just very small chunks from Open Doors, who is mostly not that involved in major collective deals, or from individuals who have a vested interest in making the market look a certain way because they're selling something. They're selling software. They're selling consulting services. So yeah, it'd be great. We don't have it right now. We really don't have very much even close to it. And I don't see a way that we get there in the next 6 to 9 months.
Andy, would you like to respond to that?
Yeah, for sure. And definitely just to like not get too sidetracked, I do actually think that the evaluation, because it tries to encompass both the collective side where it is more of the pay for play and inducements. As just one quick example that stands out is that the Cavender twins who become they're kind of the faces of NIL, right? Every major outlet has done their feature in the Cavenders. I think it was ESPN reported what they'd made over like 15 months. And prorated, it was actually scarily accurate as far as what the projection had them, right? But that gets into probably more of the marketing side versus what a collectives pay. I find a lot of times the valuation might be low because collectives are overpaying for what we hear. But like Matt said, as far as a true database, like you said, I think for athletes, there's one conversation that stands out. I think my second day of my job, a Duke cross country runner, Emily Cole, who has been also another one of those kind of faces of NIL, Olympic sport athlete, who has signed major brand deals. She told me if there was a way that I could enter, me of, okay, ACC athlete, track and field, following counts of this many on social media, and I'm based on an anonymous, like algorithm or system, I could learn what others like me or around me. Roughly, here's the range where I could get. She's like, that would be so beneficial. This is someone that wants to do NIL deals. She wrote a book, for crying out loud. She's very active. So that was like, man, this is one where there's no shady agent involved here. There's no, this is for the athlete's own good. So like that conversation, is 7 months ago. It still stands out and resonates with me as one where like, I think there would be real benefits, but it's the collection aspect, and especially of, like Matt mentioned, I think there's a lot of people that for better or worse benefit from the lack of clarity, especially if they are a quote unquote NIL agent, which, once again, back to language and what do words mean? What does that mean if you're not an officially registered agent? If you can charge marketing rates as far as what your cut is for a deal that's based on more of a roster type salary, so you can get 20 or 25% of a collective type deal, it's those types of people that probably stand to benefit the most from the current like lack of clarity, which means they won't be willing to give up that kind of data. So in a vacuum, like Matt said, certainly, as a self-interested, journalist, not TMZ over here, I would find benefits too. But hopefully, I think the athletes would be the ones that would benefit the most. But as far as getting from point A to point B, without like a subpoena, right, or breaking and entering, I don't know how the heck we get that kind of data in one place, and it might allow the wrong people to benefit. So it's a really tricky question, I think.
Great. Now I have one question for Cassandra, but Len, did you have any response to that?
No, go ahead.
Okay, great. Cassandra, I was happy earlier you mentioned our direct letter to the OCR in terms of, and this was in the context of collectives, and seeking guidance from the OCR regarding the historical inequities of promotional publicity and financial and recruiting, in addition to participation. And if we're just to sort of set the table on that, there was an excellent series last year done by USA Today on the 50th anniversary of Title IX. We also know in 2021, we had the Kaplan report in that law firm who did an analysis as part of that report that the women's basketball tournament would be worth at least $85 million a year in 2025, while the NCAA currently values the television rights for the women's tournament at $6 million a year. We know we're still 200,000 difference in participation opportunities, 1.1 billion less in scholarships, and 162 million approximately in recruiting expenditures. So my question is, do you see any issues related to gender equity in Title IX and NIL rights currently?
I think that it also goes back to the previous question about data. Is we still need more information on exactly what deals athletes are getting and how they break down across gender lines. But I do think that the Drake Group's letter that they sent to OCR is asking the right questions, because we do have to make sure that the gender equity rules are being abided by. But then that also kind of goes back to the conversation that we were just having about whether or not if collectives should go in-house and are they independent or not, because then it kind of can get into the weeds of Title IX law as to whether or not Title IX actually applies to the collectives and in what way, because in order for it to apply to the collective, like the collectives have to be either receiving funding indirectly or directly from like the school or an entity that receives federal funding in order for Title IX to apply. So I think that at this point, we kind of need to have more information and get some guidance in order to see how things are going to break down.
Great. And before we get to the Q&A, I'll pose an additional, a little bit more on Title IX and gender equity that, with a long history of disparity in those areas, do you believe that this will further motivate or incentivize women who are still suing for a share shake at participating, fair shake? Do you think that inequitable NIL activities at the school or NCAA level, not looking strictly at the marketplace, but the factors of promotion and marketing that influence the marketplace clearly, will become a factor? Matt?
I think it's possible. I was glad actually to see the Drake letter, if for no other reason that I think the Department of Education could provide some really important clarity, because these are questions that I know operators are asking right now. When I think I'll quickly say, when I think about the equity issues here with NIL, which I unquestionably think are significant and should be considered, I would really encourage academics and athletic administrators and those who might be listening that might have in a position of power to address this, to think very explicitly about what kind of proactive extra work or education or guidance that can we provide to address the market-driven inequalities within NIL. And the example that I've given a couple of times and really believe it is specifically with Black women athletes, because there are parts of the influencer marketplace systemically that are not built to reward athletes that don't fit a particular phenotype or have a particular look. And if there are brands that over-index in that world that are not built, that are built for a very specific kind of woman athlete, then somebody who's very interesting and marketable and have a lot of talents, but isn't a thin blonde woman, might not have those same opportunities. And when I bring this up to ADs, or when I bring this up to folks that work in brand building, unless they work in women's basketball, where I think you tend to understand this a little bit better, I often hear, I didn't really even think about that. Didn't occur to me that all of the shampoo companies that are doing NIL deals are only looking for a certain kind of athlete. And so then I would say, like, I think it's part of your job to think about that and then think, what other brands can I be talking to? Or who can I bring into my athletic department? Or what kind of outside voice can I bring in to elevate all of the women in my department, not just people that look like Paige Beckers? And that is, I legitimately think, is a responsibility of anybody that has a commercial stake in this enterprise.
And certainly where the collectives come in as well, right? Coming back to the collectives, I'm going to start with the Q&A here. Nobody has discussed the impact of collectives on the education of athletes. What do you think? Len?
I think it's an unanswerable question, and one, the impact of money on education. Yeah, there can be an impact, but no, not a deleterious one enough to regulate anything. I wouldn't change a thing about the current NIL system based on interference with education or interference with locker rooms or anything like that. I mean, there's no problem with locker rooms in the NBA. LeBron makes a lot more money than his teammates. I think it's not a definable issue, and to me, my gut tells me it's not an important issue.
Andy, any thoughts on that?
Once again, it's tough because collective means so much, right? Until there's one definition of it. I do think there are some that maybe are a true nonprofit, right, that have actually applied for and received the 501c3 status and truly have that charitable mission, which once again, they all claim it. So it's hard to know, who's full of it and who's not. But there certainly are some that they say, we do have financial literacy education, right? Or there are workshops. It's funny that whenever a collective is announced and they have their press release of, 12 successful business leaders in the community with vast, like it's always the same buzzwords and it looks the same, just copy and paste it, right? But there was one I was talking to recently that really stuck out about, like, they were very intentional in who's on their board. A handful of former NFL players, which is great. Probably got to have that if you're a P5 program. But there was also, they have the real estate person, they have the attorney, they have the tax person, and those come into play where it's like, all right, when someone needs help finding a place, they want to buy a house, guess what? We've got a person for that. If you unfortunately get that 2 a.m. phone call of, hey, so-and-so's in jail, for better or for worse, you've got that person on the board too. So I do think that's maybe not the exact spirit of your question, but I do think that that stuck out to me is they were very intentional about who was actually behind this collective versus a press, some press release of like, the 8 business leaders, the last 20 years, 40 under 40, blah, blah, blah. Like this was very intentional of like, we need these diverse skill sets that hopefully, it's like building a trivia team, right? You need the pop culture person, you need the music person, you need the sports person. They were very intentional about, we want these different types of folks to educate our athletes. So not to like give them too much credit, but I found that pretty interesting and insightful.
Just to be clear, I was not addressing financial literacy at all. I was addressing reading, writing, arithmetic. And I think it doesn't have a predictable or measurable effect on the athlete's education, whether they have a big, a small, or no NIL deal.
Yeah, I would agree with that too.
And that segues nicely into the next Q&A question from the audience. Basically a statement. I would argue that if a collective is a 501c3 tax exempt status granted by the IRS, full disclosure of monetary outflows should be expected. What do you think of that, Cassandra?
Well, yeah, I think on some level for some disclosure definitely should be expected. Again, a lot of this stuff is just so new that we are still trying to figure it out. Like Matt was alluding to earlier, some of these collectives have claimed 501(c)(3) status, but it kind of remains to be seen whether or not they're really operating efficiently in that space to really claim that status.
Matt, any thoughts on that?
Yeah, it's going to sound really cynical. Like as I understand it, based on the law and based on disclosure requirements, yes, we should expect there to be some element of disclosures, not some element, like exactly what's specified for 501c3s. As I understand it, some of these collectives have made a kind of cynical bet, thinking, are we exactly lined up with the definition of a charitable entity? No. But the entity that's in charge of regulating us is the Attorney General, who happens to be a State U graduate and isn't going to want to go exhaust political resources going after the State U collective. And the IRS, who might be in charge of it, has a backlog, and they're still getting to yelling at people from 2014. So by the time they get to us, everyone's going to be an employee anyway. It doesn't matter, and the banners hang forever. And I remember being a little bit horrified after hearing this argument for the first time. I don't really care that much about cheating in college athletics for winning, but ripping off taxpayers does bother me. But I'm coming around to the idea that they might be right, at least in terms of just a cynical bet of where we can get this stuff done before anybody comes and makes us stop. And we'll see what happens in a couple of months, right? I know we hired a bunch of new IRS agents, but there are several entities supporting big name schools that are making a bet on the former situation.
Andy, any thoughts on that?
What's the phrase? Is it like play stupid games, win stupid prizes? So the ones like Matt mentioned that may have filed a status and not lived up to it, I think we might eventually find out the books and see what happens there. So, I mean, legally, they have to have some form of disclosure. And they knew that going in. And if they didn't, that's part of the problem too. So I think that, like Matt mentioned, in a few weeks or a few months rather, we'll have some sense of like, here are the numbers. There's been several that have opened the books and tweeted graphics of, hey, this many donors have raised this much. And I appreciate the transparency, but this will give a better look at where the money came from and where it's going. And that's the route they chose. They could have gone LLC and for profit. They didn't. So now we get to see. So I think it's just kind of how it works, right?
Right. We can have a whole nother seminar on the employee question, the hearing, the Johnson hearing yesterday. But I'm going to go, we probably have a chance for one more question here. Do you see any trend towards NILs becoming part of the new surge of interest in sports gambling, wherein athletes would be hired to promote sports gambling? And if this is happening or may happen, do you see particular dangers in this overlap? Would you like to answer that, Len?
It sounds bad. I mean, it probably sounds worse than it is. There's two issues. There's gambling on games, and we know people are gambling on college games. There's point shaving and game fixing, which we know is terrible, and we've had in college sports, but haven't had a scandal for many years, I don't think. And then there's just sort of mixing the two. it looks bad. It doesn't scare me that much. Whether an athlete is doing an NIL deal with Coca-Cola or it's doing an NIL deal with DraftKings, I don't know that it moves the needle that much. Are his fans, his teenage fans, going to start using DraftKings more because, the point guard at North Carolina advertises DraftKings? Maybe. I don't see it. It sounds bad, but I don't see it being that bad.
Any thoughts on that, Matt?
Yeah, this is a little bit of a blind spot for me. If I'm being honest, just because I probably am more skeptical about the value of gambling as like a partner in this whole industry to begin with. I'm pretty uncomfortable with how pervasive gambling has become in every facet of sports media, and that's not just as a Puritan. That's just more that I would be worried. I'm worried about another version of the CCNY, right? And knowing that there's so many of these low major games where there aren't a whole lot of gambling operators paying a whole lot of attention. Theoretically, if we wanted to have some hijinks for an ASUN basketball game, you wouldn't need to be a master criminal to figure it out. Andy might know this better than I would. I think there are a couple of casinos that are actually doing this. I want to say there's an organization, there's some casino tied up with Gonzaga basketball players. And I think there might be some with one of the Louisianas. So it's not unheard of. My concerns are more about gambling's ubiquitousness generally, rather than just with NIL deals, though.
Right. Yeah, that's right. That's my state, and Drew Timmy at Gonzaga. Cassandra, any thoughts on that?
I'll just point out that initially, when NIL first started, the conversation started in the state legislation was being passed. Many states prohibited gambling, and a lot of schools' policies also prohibit gambling. So I think as we go on, it'll be interesting to see how that continues to play out, and if gambling really increases its foothold within the NIL space.
Andy, thank you.
One more example was a casino group. I forget if it's based in Iowa or not, but they gave $500,000 to Iowa's collective recently, which that one stood out of just like, all right, welcome to 2022 or 2023, whenever that exactly happened. We also saw, Barstool. This is the first few days of the NCAA's NIL era. They tried to sign, every athlete out there that plays college sports, and they can put that in their bio. And, I don't know how many, probably tens of thousands, if not more, were a quote unquote Barstool athlete. And you got your fancy t-shirt. But I know that there were compliance officers then that were like, hey, based on Penn National, the gaming company's stake in Barstool, can we do this or not? And that was one of those very early gray areas where it's like day 1, 2, and 3, and you're like, hey, is this Barstool thing allowed? So I do wonder, based on state laws and school policy, which once again, there's not really proof of any sort of violation of a state law. I know because I've made those calls and took weeks trying to find one. They don't exist. But I do think that's a pretty clear, for now, cut and dried way of like, a lot of policies say you can't promote a gambling operator. And frankly, if I was an athlete, especially a high profile one where there is prevalent gambling, I would be pretty terrified. We've seen a lot of examples. I think Dayton was a recent one that made headlines where even I forget the name in Ohio, but the gaming association said, if we can prove that an Ohio-based gambler is basically attacking players online, we will ban them, right? Because it got so toxic. So that's one where I don't see the benefit from the player side necessarily, because they're already open to that. And now if they're promoting gambling companies, they're even more, it's not victim blaming. They didn't ask for it, right? But there's enough terrible people and fans out there, frankly, that would take that as an opening to attack them. So I don't see the benefit for athletes.
Thanks, Andy. And boy, a t-shirt, that's a lure for your name, image, and likeness, isn't it? So I just want to thank my panelists. Everyone so great today. Thank you so much for your time, your knowledge, your expertise. Thank you for everyone attending our webinar today. And I just want to end with making sure that you tune in on Thursday, March 30th for our next webinar, as well as our spring symposium coming up at the National Press Club in April 18th. So thank you, everyone, and we'll see you soon.